This podcast is a quest for well-being, a quest for a meaningful life through the exploration of fundamental truth. Enlightening ideas, insights on physical, mental, and spiritual health. The inspiration is love. The aspiration is to awaken new ways of thinking that can lead us to a new way of being well. Welcome to Body, Mind, and Soul Healing Conversations.
At Wellbridge, wellness is an integral part of any treatment plan. A sound body and engaged spirit are essential to a healthy mind. The patient's needs are met through recreational programs customized to their needs. Their wellness center offers a variety of services, including yoga, massage therapy, fitness rooms, and therapy pools. Wellbridge provides holistic and individualized treatment. The goal is to get patients back on the road to a healthy, productive life. Valeria interviews Dr. Christopher Yadron. He is the CEO of Wellbridge, a licensed clinical professional counselor, a certified alcohol and drug counselor, innovative strategist, and speaker. Christopher Yadron, Ph.D., is a mission-focused executive with 25 years of nonprofit leadership and behavioral healthcare experience. He has served in numerous leadership capacities throughout his career, and his capabilities include extensive clinical and behavioral expertise, robust budgetary proficiency, and strong interpersonal experience. Yadron is an innovative strategist adroit at building sustainable patient services while leveraging philanthropic initiatives to advance care and education. Yadron is a stalwart leader who is passionate about reversing the stigma of addiction, helping individuals to seek the help they need to recover. As CEO, Dr. Yadron's responsibilities span both strategic and operational areas, building upon the current strategic vision, branding, marketing, and business plan, and evolving all functional areas of the organization towards goals of delivering exceptional patient experiences while achieving overall business success. Yadron received his doctorate degree from the Chicago School of Professional Psychology and his master's degree in counseling psychology at Loyola University in Chicago. He is a licensed clinical professional counselor and a certified alcohol and drug counselor. Yadron often speaks at conferences and workshops on addiction and the family, counselor training and development, and organizational leadership. Meet Dr. Christopher at wellbridge.org. Here's the interview with Dr. Christopher Yadron.
In your own words, who is Christopher Yadron?
Well, that feels like a big question to try to tackle on a podcast. First of all, thanks for having me today. I currently am the CEO of Wellbridge Addiction Treatment and Research. My background is in psychology. I have a Ph.D. in counseling psychology, and for a good part of my life, for 25 or more years professionally, I've spent most of that time working directly with individuals and families and groups around mental health in general, and then quite a bit of work specifically in terms of helping support individuals find paths to recovery and healing and wholeness as they work through concerns regarding addiction and the behaviors and the harms associated. In the last number of years, last 5 to 10 years especially, my work has been more focused exclusively on leadership and organizational development and management for behavioral healthcare organizations. And I've shifted a bit at this point in my life to really focusing on developing staff and people who have a commitment to and function as healers themselves, and creating organizations that have a very positive culture for staff and for people who want to serve that way and help people with behavioral health and specifically substance use issues. So that's what I've been doing lately. I'm personally, just very pleased at this point in my life with my partner and spouse, my wife, Megan, and my daughter, Ellie.
Yeah.
And, it's a good place to be personally, too.
I love to hear that, Chris. That's what we all want to say, right? I'm in a good place. It feels good to be me. Sometimes we want it to be a destination, a place where we just stay. We
Right.
get there and we stay there forever, but it doesn't quite happen because life changes, and that's such an interesting adventure as I see it. I have another question, initial question. Before I have so many questions for you here, the open ones. But before I ask those questions, let me go back. I know you're not working as a counselor at this time, but you're still working in the field of mental health and helping others with addiction indirectly. What inspired you to become a counselor in the first place?
That's a good question. I grew up in a home where drinking and substance use created a lot of conflict and difficult, challenging experiences as a very young child. I'm the oldest in my family. My parents were very young when I was born, so there were times, and this is not meant to sound disparaging toward my parents, but even as a young child where I might have been the most responsible one in the house that day. So I think from a very early place in my life, I was conditioned, if you will, to be oriented toward helping others, playing the role of a peacemaker, being a resource, and then deriving a certain level of, I think, satisfaction and fulfillment as a result of doing that. I followed that course for quite a way into my professional life, and I'm 51 now. I came to a point of burnout fairly early, around 30 years old, because I don't know if I was fully aware of how conditioned I was to do that, without any regard for my own personal boundaries, my true motivations, the ability to be more altruistic in terms of giving and supportive. And so long answer, but it's very wrapped up with my personal life. And I think over the years, though, I've separated that out and I think come at it from a much more centered and helpful place at this point.
Yeah, I love to hear that. And it's interesting to hear you saying that, especially the part of being a peacemaker, because I remember doing the same thing around my family. Growing up with a lot of dysfunction, if I can use that word, a lot of confusion, really. That's what it was. It's very confusing to see the violent behaviors. And then, I was trying to make everyone feel better. But then I was a child, and that's not really something that children should be doing. That didn't lead me to addiction, substance abuse. But I remember having a lot of addictive behaviors, per se, because I didn't feel loved. Then I was looking for that love out there when I left my family. Then I was looking for, in a very powerful way, that to me, it's the more I hear the description of addiction, I see, wow, it's something that controls us. So I felt controlled by those feelings, that I had to feel loved by somebody else. So the question to you is that something that you experienced as well? It could be work too. I became that way too.
Yeah, absolutely.
Workaholic, some people call it.
I think fundamental to the definition of addiction is loss of control, like as you mentioned a few moments ago. And people can become, can have that experience of a loss of control, or where there's a level of preoccupation and the role that either a substance or a behavior takes in a person's life becomes all-consuming. And there's that fundamental element of a lack of control, and whether that's relationships or love or sexuality, it can be a substance like drugs or alcohol, and it can be in relationship to certainly things like work or gambling or many, many different things. Obviously, the way that we interact with these things has a physiological impact, but there are strong psychological pulls in terms of the needs that they meet and the role that they play in our lives.
It's fascinating to see how everything's connected. the body, the mind, and how it's sometimes very challenging to have clarity, to see with clarity what's happening. And that took me many years. So another open question is about mental health. What is mental health from your perspective? What is to be mentally healthy? What does it look like?
Yeah, that's a great question. Sorry, I'm it's provocative in a lot of ways because I think it includes so much in the way that we think about mental health. I mean, typically the connotation of mental has more of the connotation is more aligned with how we think or our thought life. But I think mental health, I also like to think in terms of wellness or behavioral health. Although that term also feels slightly reductionistic to me. Almost any term feels slightly reductionistic because we're really whole people. So are the kinds of thoughts that we think positive and affirmative of ourselves and of others? When we experience emotions, are we able to experience those emotions with a certain level of appropriate, like, awareness and detachment, so we're not over identified with those things, but we can recognize the role that they play in our lives. And even, negative, quote unquote, negative emotions. I mean, the experience of sadness is an indicator of things that we value in our lives that we perceive to be at risk or perhaps we've lost. So when I think about mental health, I think about the connection between our behaviors, our body, our thoughts, our emotions, and is there a positive way of being in the world for both ourselves and our orientation towards others? So that's the way I would frame it.
Yeah, I love that. It resonates true to me. The positivity without being, if I can use, deluded. I remember being that way. Very much trying as hard as I could to see everything, myself and everything and everyone, the whole world in a positive light. Mm-hmm. But then it was not really the reality, and I was often re-traumatized.
Right.
So that's interesting to even kind of talk about these things, because positivity, it's something to be defined, right, Chris, by ourselves too. We need to make sure not to create our own ideas of what life is or try to believe things that are not real per se.
Right. Yeah. The research actually shows inauthentic positivity is actually harmful to one's mental health or mental well-being. So if I'm genuinely need to, or perhaps ought to, experience something that feels painful or challenging, to act as if that isn't real or to simply try to put a positive spin isn't actually very beneficial. So I think part of mental health means that when I face challenges or things that I don't understand, things that are outside of my control, is my orientation to those things such that it's a path that's leading me in a constructive and beneficial way. It may or may not be positive in a sense of how it feels, but it's positive in a sense of the growth and the benefit to myself or to others in the process, or to the community I'm a part of.
That's a beautiful way of perceiving this reality. And that makes me think about spirituality. Do you have any spiritual views of yourself in the world, of life itself, and also practices?
That's also a very interesting question for me. I started out the very early part of my career. I went to seminary, a Christian seminary, Presbyterian actually, and became a Presbyterian minister.
Oh, wow. I didn't know that. Surprise.
Not that I would reduce my sense of spirituality to religious practice or affiliation. But that's where I began in life professionally. And there's a lot of story or narrative back in the background. I don't know, given our time today, but I found that initially I was in an environment, though, that I found to be somewhat limiting or restrictive in that experience. So as I as I shifted in my professional identity from an ordained minister now many years ago to a professional counselor, my sense of spirituality relative to openness, acceptance, connection, really dramatically changed in my life. So my spirituality at this point I would define in much more humanistic terms. Words like acceptance are fundamental to me versus right or wrong and sort of the shame guilt structures that are oftentimes, not for all, but for some, the experience of some when it comes to more religious versus spiritual frameworks. But it's been a path leading towards openness, acceptance, and a different way of being in the world than try to find sort of a singular truth and getting it right and being either good or bad.
Right. I love that. The word openness, that to me includes acceptance. That's a big one. Once we are open, then acceptance arises almost naturally. It has been my experience. So that sounds really positive in that
Absolutely.
sense of healthy positive.
Yeah.
Do you use the word God? Or that's something that you refrain and you stay away from?
In my work with others or?
In general.
Not necessarily. Excuse me. I suppose earlier in my life, probably far more often, it's a term that is so full and I don't know if loaded is the right word, but if I use the word God and you use the word God, the chances of us landing on the same planet, so to speak, could be rather challenging unless we have the opportunity to discuss the nuance and the sense of how we might be framing that. There are people in recovery where that often becomes a stumbling point in recovery from addiction, and certainly the utilization of traditional and 12-step communities and the 12 steps makes references to God quite often. In that framework, it's the God of your understanding. For some people who identify more in a atheistic or agnostic framework, where it's very hard for them to get there, there's a common, well-known acronym where reframing the word God is just simply good, orderly direction. So whether it's a higher power, a God of your understanding, a sense of what might be good, orderly direction for well-being and health in your life, and then other, very clear historical and religious traditions which inform that word. So I'm probably careful if I use it just because it feels like a pretty big word to use.
I have another question for you, open question. But before that, because we are talking about spirituality, I want to mention that you are the CEO of Wellbridge. So I'll be asking you a lot more questions about the company.
Sure.
But an open question now, do you use spiritual methods within the approach at Wellbridge?
I would say absolutely. Again, even the word spirituality can be hard to, or it means many things to different people. So I would say we use spiritual methods in a sense of, in the most general sense, we want to treat the spirit of a person and their sense of human dignity and personhood in a fundamental way. Also, addiction tends to lead to alienation, isolation, versus recovery is about belonging and connection. So helping people find ways to reestablish connection and create belonging and community, I think, is a component of at least humanistic spirituality. I've also worked in environments years ago where people with addiction needs and psychiatric or behavioral health needs were often treated with a great deal of stigma and disrespect, even in medical and professional environments or environments that purport to be therapeutic or healing environments. And so I think coming to a place like Wellbridge, and Wellbridge is a very intentionally designed place, even in terms of the physical space in which we invite people to come and to heal and to grow. There's a way in which we're inviting people here to be met with kindness, respect, dignity, compassion, that I would truly believe meets people at a level of the human spirit in a pretty fundamental way.
And that answers my question about spirituality. That's how I
Good.
see it. Right. That's beautiful. Thank you, Chris. And another open question. I have too many. I have to skip them, some of them. But for now, what are some of the most common misconceptions about addiction that you have come across?
That's a great question. I really appreciate the conversation. One of the things that's problematic about addiction, there's two things that come to mind. One of the most common perceptions of addiction is that it is somehow within a person's control, that it's really an issue of irresponsibility or poor choices. But addiction, if someone is diagnosed with a substance use disorder, the very nature of the diagnosis or the very nature of the condition is a loss of control. It's represented by progressive neurological and physiological changes, oftentimes psychological and developmental challenges, as well as a result of time spent under the influence and the impact of these substances on a person's life. And so then, as I said earlier on the podcast, the very nature of addiction is a loss of control. And one of the most common misperceptions is that if people really want change badly enough, they would just make different choices. But no one welcomes or wants addiction into their lives. So I think that's one of the biggest misconceptions. I think from a treatment standpoint, one of the biggest problems or misconceptions is that there's a one-size-fits-all approach for people. So, for example, people might be familiar with, like a 28-day program for rehab or rehabilitation. It's increasingly this is changing, but certainly in the past, most programs were fairly programmatic, and it's not a very personalized or sophisticated way to approach the illness or the condition. If one of us had cancer and we went to the oncologist and the oncologist prescribed the same treatment, regardless of the stage of the cancer, the location, the type of cancer, and the way that it was impacting us personally, we all just received the same dose of chemotherapy or the same surgery, it would be obviously clearly inappropriate. When someone needs to be treated for addiction, you need to take into account what are the positive supports in their system, what are their positive coping mechanisms that exist, what's their unique, what are the unique substances that have been impacting their lives, how does this taken shape in their own life in a personalized way. And so some people might need inpatient and some people might need outpatient treatment. Some people need significant detoxification. Others just need much longer psychosocial interventions over a period of time. But bottom line is it's important to personalize care and not just use a one-size-fits-all approach.
I'm not familiar with the health care system in the country and how it works, but I have heard a lot about it. That's one of the biggest complaints for some people that I have interviewed in my own personal life around me, that it's just too generalized and there are too many rules and protocols. So before they get to the end of all that, the patient is actually in a much worse condition. So there's too many steps, too many protocols to follow, and not enough, I would call it intuition, that human connection, just seeing deeper how unique everyone is or each case is. So I love that your company has this vision. That's really wonderful to hear. Another question I have, earlier, about the misconceptions of addiction, you mentioned, the judgment on behavior and kind of assuming that somebody can change, can choose better. But that's very humbling to me because I have actually applied this my entire life as a general rule, not to judge anyone because we don't know. We simply don't know. Even when they're behaving in a very violent way, doing horrible things, there's always room for curiosity and observation and understanding. that's something that really speaks to me deeply as a human being. So I'm glad you mentioned that too, because we don't know what other people are going through. Sometimes it's just a brain dysfunction, an imbalance. We don't know.
I couldn't agree more, and I really appreciate your perspective on that. Also, there's an ancient quote. Nothing. What is it? Nothing human is alien to me. Um, if you've, maybe it's become more common now, but and I forget the source of that, but I think it's the idea, at least the way I understand that is, if I had your circumstances and I were in the exact same place, I might choose very similarly. And so who am I to judge, right? Which I think is your point. And then from an addiction standpoint, there really are changes that occur that make the choices pretty impossible. If you imagine, you're riding atop, of a large animal like a horse, or, if you're in Asia and you're riding on top of an elephant, and suddenly the elephant or the horse became frightened and went running wildly, right, in a dangerous way. There's really no way you would be powerless to stop that from happening, right, until that changed in through other circumstances. And there's ways in which certainly we need to be responsible for choices and engage treatment, and it's not an all or nothing, but the way addiction functions, powerlessness really is at the root of it. So for people to come and to say, I need help, to be surrounded with a therapeutic community, to begin to learn skills to manage concerns and feelings and emotions and challenges differently, it's very hard to overcome alone. And so the importance of community is really, and having a strong support system is really important.
So going back to Wellbridge, talk to me a bit more about the treatments. I know you have been talking about already, actually, but I would love to know more about the specific holistic approach that you offer. And also, what do you treat? I read on your website, substance use disorder, and then also co-occurring psychiatric disorders, like so many. And then you have all this list of disorders: bipolar disorder, borderline depression, eating disorder, and many others. So I didn't know that. It makes a lot of sense to me, but these psychiatric disorders, they are consequences of substance use disorder. Is that correct, Chris?
I would say yes and no, or perhaps yes and yes, depending if I'm recalling the framing of the questions correctly. It's I think sometimes individuals can develop an addiction in its own right, and it may or may not lead to other problems. But for some individuals, that addiction becomes compromising or challenging in a way that other forms of mental illness or mental disorders develop relative to anxiety or depression or other kinds of things. So, and then there are individuals who develop more other psychiatric disorders, and substances become a way of coping and managing some of those concerns, and may just be a tool for the person to manage those psychiatric symptoms and concerns, or it might develop into a true co-occurring addiction at the same time, or substance use disorder, comorbid or alongside of the psychiatric concern. I guess my point is it's a two-way street, and they really do influence each other. You take eating disorders, for example. Sometimes individuals might use stimulants to aid their goals or the goals or intentions of the eating disorder. There's a tremendous amount of shame and guilt and depression associated with eating disorders, and so sometimes the use of substances becomes compensatory to deal with those strong feelings. But if you're using particular kinds of substances and have an addiction or a substance use disorder, it affects your eating habits and it affects your physiology in a way where, so that's just one example. The other thing about substance use disorders, generally when people begin to use and use regularly in a way that it becomes their true preoccupation, their other roles and ability to function become highly compromised. their ability to manage emotions, interpersonal interactions, that goes really offline for a period of time if they're deep into their addiction. So imagine, imagine a school-age child who, stopped taking math in third grade and then suddenly is put into a math class their first year of college, and they've missed everything in between. It would feel overwhelming. They wouldn't know what to do. It would be anxiety provoking. So when people start using at a young age, and the average age that people begin using substances, at least in the US domestically, is somewhere around 12 or 13 years old. And as that escalates, they miss out on all of these very formative years in terms of how do I manage my emotions? How do I build healthy relationships? How do I address challenges and conflicts? So you can get a lot of interaction between general behavioral health or psychiatric presentations mixed with substance use. You asked me a question as well about Wellbridge treatment and the way we approach it. Do you want me to?
Yes, please.
I got
yes, Chris.
away a bit on comorbidity and co-occurring disorders, but
yeah.
So Wellbridge addiction treatment and research is a 130-bed licensed facility and Joint Commission regulated facility on Eastern Long Island in New York. We're a inpatient and residential facility, and we work obviously with a lot of outpatient facilities for the continuity of care. But we have 130 beds here for individuals to come and become stabilized, and then have additional time in residential treatment to develop the skills and deal with the psychological and social concerns that addiction brings. Most people who come here everyone who comes here has a substance use disorder. That's a requirement. And then the vast majority of the individuals who come here have some co-occurring mental health or psychiatric concern relative to anxiety, an eating disorder, a form of depression, or some other psychiatric or behavioral health concern. The treatment here really is intended to be very holistic. Sorry for the pause. I'm getting water there. So primarily when people first come to Wellbridge, there's a lot of physiological concerns and discomfort and challenges. So the first steps are usually more medically oriented with our team of physicians and nurse practitioners and physician assistants and our nursing team to make sure that people have the right medications and the right medical support to begin to heal. As people become more stable in the first week of their treatment physiologically, then they can go on to begin to address some of the psychological and social components of the diagnoses and the conditions that they have. And that involves individual and group counseling. It involves being a part of a healthy and sober community. It involves some work with one's family or primary support system. And then we have a lot of supportive therapies and opportunities for people to heal as well beyond those medical and psychological and social concerns, just in terms of overall body and personal wellness. So we have the fitness center. We use we have a creative arts building in which we use art and painting and music in various therapeutic ways, drum circles, for example. To help people connect and heal in ways that might be less verbal or less analytical. It's certainly very, very accessible for people who, need to reconnect with themselves and others in ways involving music, the body movement, exercise. So there are a lot of other opportunities that way as well.
Yeah, I love to hear that. You said that earlier. So it's actually addressing the whole person, how it should be, because that's what we are, human beings, whole human beings.
Right.
That's great. And I wanted to correct earlier, my question was meant actually, I intended to ask that question about the relationship between substance use disorders and psychiatric disorders. But I wanted to ask that question, but I wanted to make the correction that on your website, it's very clear. It's not you're not making that relationship, really, that connection. You're just outlining the what you treat. So for some reason, I read co-occurring as correlated or for some reason, I understood it that way. That's interesting how the brain works sometimes. You look at the word and probably I wanted to ask that question and then it connected everything. How?
Yeah. It's a slightly different nuance, but they can be both occurring or present, and they can be related in terms of the interaction. So I appreciate you thinking about both.
Yeah, thank you for that too, for the clarity, and then that I couldn't see it, and then you corrected. There's another point that, I read that on your website too. It reads, we recognize that the family suffers alongside the patient and integrate treatment and support programs for the family. So that caught my attention because I know personally how mental health or having somebody around you that's not mentally well, how can that affect us? I remember being very much affected by not just one person, but in two cases in my life. So that's really great to see your company doing that too, recognizing that, which is kind of obvious. It was to me, I was not a professional. So when it comes to that, do you also offer treatment for the family too? Because from my point of view, from the experiences I had, I needed support, not just support in a way. It seems like I need some sort of treatment, perhaps not medication, but meditation or some sort of work. I needed something, but I was never advised by the professions around me at the time.
I think ignoring or avoiding the family would be similar to maybe some of our earlier comments. If someone was experiencing an illness that was affecting both their body and mind, or affecting them as a whole person, and we just treated their body, I think we would clearly and more immediately recognize how reductionistic or unfortunate that would be. As human beings, we're fundamentally social creatures or social animals as well. It's a highly unique circumstance to be completely isolated. And then if that were to be the case, there's a certain lack of wellness, or, there's something that seems, I'm struggling to find the right word, but
unnatural, perhaps. Right?
Yeah, exactly. Right? And some people want relationship or need relationship more than others, but to be completely devoid of relationship, or to always be in the sense of my whole identity is informed by the other, I think those are two extremes we want to avoid. But as human beings, it's natural to be in relationship. So to avoid the family would be just as reductionistic or unfortunate. It's an important part. Many treatment centers, again in the U.S. domestically, are offering family education. We do offer family counseling or family therapy where indicated and needed. Every patient who comes here should have, at a minimum, again, we personalize care, but as a general rule, one individual session a week in addition to all the group sessions, but then one family session a week, and opportunities for families to visit the campus or to be engaged through telehealth or telemedicine formats to be engaged, and certainly to be a part of the treatment planning and the treatment process when the identified patient is willing to do so. It's important. The patient is going to, at some point, re-engage this family system or support system, and it's going to interact with their condition. And so it's important that they're prepared for what to expect and how to navigate that successfully towards wellness and towards health. And then the family, like you mentioned a few moments ago, they need support. They need help. One of the unique things about addiction or substance use disorders, I think, is the interaction if you look at the symptoms of the illness or the condition, it's almost almost uncanny the way family members experience symptoms of substance use in an almost equivalent or identical way. Obviously, it's not around a substance, but the symptomology is almost identical. So, I could give you some examples. The person using a substance, or you used relationships or love perhaps before. If that's my addiction, I'm preoccupied with that substance or process every day, right? If it's love, it's what does this other person think of me? Am I understanding? Am I connected? Am I not connected? If it's alcohol, it's when can I drink? I need to drink. I want to drink. People are trying to stop me drinking. I want to drink more. I'm preoccupied. A family member isn't preoccupied with alcohol. They're preoccupied with their loved one, right? So is my loved one alive? Is he safe? Is she going to come home? Is she not going to come home? Is she going to stop? Is it going to be okay? And their whole lives become oriented around trying to manage and protect and help and this person. So I don't mean to belabor the point, but you can go right down whether it's preoccupation, anxiety, tolerance. So many of these things around addiction affect family members deeply. So we need to provide them help too. Oh, can I throw in one other? A point I want to make as well, and I sit on the board separate from Wellbridge, the National Association for Children of Addiction. And one of the pieces for addiction too around family that are often forgotten are the way it impacts little kids. So we, oftentimes, excuse me, we provide some support for older children in the family, and certainly spouses and partners and individuals in the family system that make up that group. But little kids, 3, 4, 5 years old through 12 years old, they get hurt quite a bit by this too. And I think it's important to think about how do we help people talk to their kids in developmentally appropriate ways about their illness? How do we help them think about parenting in ways that they may need help with now that they've sought recovery? And then the needs of the kids themselves. They don't have a clinical disorder, but they've been harmed, they've been hurt. So they need to know it's not their fault, that help is available, that emotions are okay to feel. And it's I could go on, but I just think that's an important piece of the family.
Wow, what's not to love about it? Yes, taking in consideration everything, just right. That's such a beautiful approach to life in general. I don't separate life in the sense of my personal life and professional life. To me, it's all the same. The way I see myself and people around me, the people closest to me, is the way that I would tend to see others. So I love the idea that we can begin with ourselves always. And I love the way you speak, because I can hear that comes from your understanding of life and yourself. It's a very deep one. It's a very inclusive one. And it's, healthy and beautiful, I have to say. So thank you, Chris, for being here.
I'm honored by that. And thanks for that recognition, or for seeing me that way. I appreciate it.
Wow, yes, very much. We actually met today to talk about the holidays and how they affect people with addiction issues. So talk to me for a moment about that. Why is that a struggle for some people with addiction problems? The holidays, what is the relationship? I have an idea, but I would love to hear from you more details on that.
Sure. It can be challenging for people for a number of reasons. Some things that come to mind. So for example, we oftentimes think of holidays as very happy times, but for individuals who have experienced grief or loss acutely, and oftentimes or sometimes connected with a holiday, those are very challenging times, because those are the pressure, the push is to be happy or to feel positive, but it can be painful for people. And sometimes addiction is connected to self-medication or a desire to relieve oneself of emotions that feel hurtful or harmful. Other thing about holidays that are challenging is a lot of our holidays are centered around eating and drinking in particular alcohol. And the healthy, appropriate use of alcohol is one thing, but for whether it's the family system using alcohol in a way that's harmful, or just simply individuals who are struggling with their own use of drugs or alcohol, it's just very challenging to be in an environment where they feel as if they cannot participate, or perhaps they feel strange or awkward or out of place, or, and then yet other reasons, many families, and I should say almost all families, have some degree of conflict or tension in relationships. And so those things become more pronounced when people get together and spend time together around the holidays. And they become triggers for people to drink or to use. So it's important as individuals are trying to understand use that is harmful or addictive for themselves. What are the triggers that tend to bring me back to feeling an urge or a craving to use? Craving can be more physical, but an urge can involve quite a few psychological and social triggers. So the holidays become a flashpoint or a trigger point for those things.
What I hear from you is, we not hear from pretty much everybody that I interview on the psychologists and spiritual teachers, emotions and feelings. I wonder, why do we manage to escape these strong feelings so much instead of listening to them and pausing and kind of addressing them in a healthy way? It's fascinating how so many of us do that as a habit. And then with that in mind, the question for you is, have you seen this in your practice and from your experience? Have you seen this to be the cause, or perhaps one of the causes within so many other causes there might be for addiction? But would you say that trying to escape emotions, strong emotions, being the main reason why some people, and especially young people, get addicted?
Absolutely. I mean, it may not be the source of the addiction, but it may likely be the initial source or lever that pushes me toward use in a way that gives me relief from emotions that feel overwhelming or I have difficulty understanding. Emotions play a pretty big role around addiction. The use of chemicals in particular or substances typically causes my emotions to be either blunted or flattened to a degree where I'm not experiencing or aware of my emotion, or my emotions feel somewhat out of control and highly, too expansive. I would also say, just in general, to your earlier comments about emotion, I don't know, and cultures and societies differ from one another, right? So masculinity for myself and growing in the United States and Chicago and the particular family I have, and so how are emotions viewed versus experienced in other cultures? I know there's a great, it's very dynamic and a lot of variance there, but I don't, speaking for myself and my own background, I don't know if we're really always properly taught or allowed to experience a full range of emotions, and then what's the role or the value they play. And so fear plays an important adaptive factor in my life. It keeps and protects me from harm. I mentioned earlier, sadness is an indication of the things I value in life that might be at risk. Anger is a way of finding strength and energy to promote and seek justice and correct, something that might be wrong or harmful. So obviously those things become disordered but there's just so much there. And aside from addiction, in terms of our ability to really allow ourselves to experience the full range of emotion, to allow others that we care about to do so. I think of my children. It pains me if I hear, my youngest daughter, if I hear her sadness, and I have to mentally restrain myself from wanting to shut that down versus honor that space for her. So, do we allow each other, much less ourselves, to feel a full range of emotion, which is part of the full experience of being human and living life? That's just a big question, way beyond addiction. I think that's just a human question that we have a lot to learn, to grow, and opportunity to find there.
I know you mentioned early the healthy use of alcohol. So what would that be for those listening?
A loaded question, and I'll probably get in trouble, I suppose, if with certain groups. I mean, from a chemical, from the chemical structure of alcohol, there are. There's no sort of nutrient value. When alcohol is metabolized, for example, in the system, it's all there's the body doesn't retain some aspect of that for a nutritional value. I'm not a physician, so I don't want to speak out of scope. I know that in terms of studies that might suggest very limited use of alcohol has some particular health benefits. I'm not really concerned about drinking in general as much as I'm concerned about trying to help and treat and support individuals where it's really become a disordered part of their lives that is generating brokenness in relationships, a loss of control, sort of a disconnection from themselves, from others, from their sense of God, if that's part of their framework of an orientation of understanding the world. And so, yeah, that becomes a tricky and controversial question, So aside from, so I think, people can think of it on a continuum, right? I can use a medication as prescribed that I receive. I can use a medication that's sort of contrary to the prescription, and it may have a harmful effect. It doesn't necessarily mean I have an addiction, so you can move from use to misuse. But if I'm using that medication or if I'm using that substance pretty much to manage every day, and that becomes a central focal point of my life, I need this, like there's a sense of survival around this. There's a sense of preoccupation. The control issues are present that we mentioned before. It's starting to affect and harm my body, my mind, my relationships, my emotions. And I really feel like I can't stop. I can't control this. That's then we're in, the territory of addiction. And so I think working compassionately with individuals to try to understand the differences along the lines of that continuum from use to misuse to addiction is important. There are differences between substances too, in terms of their impact on the body and how people become, how many people become addicted. And there's a lot to talk about there in terms of the research, but excuse me. As Wellbridge, we're most concerned with really helping people who have reached that point where they recognize, or the people who care for them recognize, that something needs to change because they want their loved one back, or they want their true self back, and it's been lost and misconstrued by the use of these things. And so we want to try to help them find their way.
Fair enough. I understand where you're coming from. So the focus, your focus is different. Yeah. I guess I asked the question because I don't engage with alcohol in my life. I never, voluntarily, I would never do it. Yeah. But then my husband, he likes drinking red wine with pasta dish when we have some foods, not every day. And that, to me, it feels like it's healthy. Mm-hmm. I don't have a whole glass. I can't have it anyway, but right. I become dizzy. But then he pours like one glass and just half, and then I have less than half, and he has some. But I also noticed that when he's stressed and he perhaps needs a conversation more than alcohol, he goes for that, in a sense of even coming up with a dish that would go, because we have certain dishes that go with red wine. He would suggest all of a sudden to have that dish, and I already know that that's the reason why. Wow, it's I see the way you are kind of making that observation: use, misuse, and then addiction. I'm just very careful with that, and my concern is that if I was not around my husband and he went through a very traumatic situation, lost a loved one all of a sudden or something, that would be his medication in a way. He would go for alcohol. So that's one of my concerns.
Yeah, absolutely. Hopefully not. I think, if someone uses something to change their mood one time, it may or may not be particularly harmful, but if you use that repeatedly and it becomes a pattern, then that becomes the well-worn path toward coping with that particular stressor or emotion or condition. When I was you think of a path in the forest, it's a well-worn path. It's easy to tread, and you're going to go. If you've ever gone off the path in a dense forest, it can be very challenging to do that well, right? I mean, there's thorns and bristles, and there's and obstacles. So when it comes to coping with the more challenging aspects of life, the more that becomes a deep-seated pattern. And then if you get hooked physiologically, and that becomes then kind of combined, like this psychological urge combined with a physiological craving to use, it can just become so overwhelming for people. But it typically doesn't happen overnight. But I can see why you're concerned if you're, if that appears to be the trajectory or a potential pathway.
So another curious question, gosh, this one, it's alcohol, the drug of use of most people at Wellbridge, from your experience in this field, or it's a different kind of drug? I would love to know that too.
Yeah. So in my experience over the last, certainly substance use treatment, specific treatment in the last, decade plus, alcohol far and away is typically it's usually 60 to 70% of the population. That's the primary concern. It varies, where sometimes people are using alcohol plus other substances or primarily using a substance and sometimes engaging in alcohol. It can be one or the other, but I'd say 70% on average of patients, that's their primary concern.
Wow, Chris. Yeah, I didn't want to hear that.
Oh.
Yeah, because it's legal, right? So
yeah,
that's easy access. So
it's legal. There's social, we're socialized to view it as highly acceptable. To the legal point, it's very accessible, not only acceptable, but accessible for people. It just, it's also, if I use, certain, powerful opiates or opioids, and I use those regularly, the path toward, addiction and the path toward negative consequences can come more rapidly or with a much greater degree of lethality, much quicker in my life. My likelihood of dying sooner and in a terrible way just feels more pronounced. And alcohol has typically, unless you're involved in, a terrible auto accident or some other accident related illness. But if I'm going to develop an illness physically over time in my life with alcohol, it just takes more time. So our sense of the danger, our sense of risk, our sense of the consequences early, when we still have a sense of agency or control, is much more muted and mitigated by the time frame. So it's a challenge.
Yeah, it saddens me to hear that because it is legal, accepted, accessible, as you said.
Yeah.
So that makes the problem much bigger too. So what is your message at the level of, I know I'm not political and I try not to talk about politics here, but what is your message for the leaders, let's say, I have to say it that way, for the leaders of this country, of the United States? What is your suggestion or advice?
Yeah, well, a couple things. I would say I'm appreciative and grateful for some of the legislative changes that have been made in the recent years and decade relative to parity for substance use and mental health. It wasn't that long ago where these were conditions that were allowed to be excluded by payers and health benefits or so care has been expanded in recent years for these conditions. And I think that's really important. And I think recognition ought to be given for the work that's been done. I think there's always opportunities for additional changes that make access for substance use and mental health treatment easier and just more accessible for individuals. Access is, there was the Surgeon General's report from 2017, not that long ago. I mean, a number of years back now, but really not that long ago, identified, I think, 1 to maybe 2 individuals who need treatment in this country for substance use disorder actually get treatment. And I think there's a variety of reasons for that. It could be funding and a number of things, but there's also such a tremendous amount of stigma around addiction. So anything elected officials can do to create laws and legislate in a way that removes barriers, reduces stigma, and allows people to just receive care in ways that they might receive care for other common medical problems is really, really important. We've come a long way, and yet there's still a lot of barriers and a lot of stigma relative to the condition.
Right. Yeah, that's another sad news. But thank you for saying that too. I guess I was hoping, I don't like to hope, but I was wishing to hear from you from the perspective of prevention. What can we do as leaders to minimize the consumption of alcohol? It was legal at some point, right, Chris? Alcohol, from what I was told, and then became legal.
Yeah, there was a period of prohibition in the United States from approximately 1919 to 1932, if I have my dates correct, in which alcohol was banned and was illegal, referred to as prohibition in the United States. But it wasn't necessarily effective. People found ways. I'm not a historian, but it actually exacerbated a number of problems, and so that was reversed. But when I think about prevention, I mean, you can attempt to address the problem directly, but I think there are a lot of other things that might be more intuitive and less obvious, or less, I guess, less more indirect versus directly related. I mean, you mentioned earlier, made the statement about the power of unconditional love and how that make a difference in the world. So anything we can do to provide and create healthy families for children to thrive. And, trauma, we haven't talked about this yet today much, but trauma plays a huge role in sort of the etiology or the origins of substance use and mental health concerns. So I think creating safe places for children and for families, I think addressing this from the point of view of who we might become and the benefits that we might and the wellness we might experience as if we pursue things outside of substances is also a really positive message. I grew up in the 80s, and I don't, I know you mentioned living abroad, living in different countries internationally. In the 80s, there was a commercial, drug awareness campaign, where they crack an egg into a frying pan. This is your brain. This is your brain on drugs. And it's, I don't know if you're familiar, but
yes, I have seen that. Yeah.
Yeah. It's, my point is not to question the merits of that approach as much as just recognize that's an approach that says, if you use drugs, you're going to be harmed, you're going to die, you're going to get hurt. I think one of the things we've found in working with children and adolescents in schools is kind of focusing more on the positive aspects of what you can attain, who you might be, who you might become, the benefits of wellness and health. So I think that's choosing from a positive place versus a negative consequential place. The other thing that is important, it's been a few years since I've been as focused on adolescent care, but social norming, or what is socially normative, and making that clear for students is really important. So oftentimes adolescents have the perception that everyone uses drugs, everyone uses substances. I'm weird, I'm odd, I'm different if I don't. But actually, if you look at what's socially normative, the vast majority of adolescents, the majority of adolescents are not engaging in regular substance use. So helping people to understand that I can be who I am and make healthy choices or have a particular lifestyle free of substances is actually socially normative. I'm not somehow the only person not engaged in this. So anyway, I'll go back. Circle back to your unconditional love comment, and keeping trauma, more love in and less trauma, and keeping trauma out, and that'll make a huge difference right there.
That's a beautiful message that I needed to hear now from you and my audience too, right? That's the focus of what I do, self-love. But I know it starts with us, so it would be much more complicated to try to pass that on, to love somebody else unconditionally if we have not been practicing that ourselves.
I couldn't agree more. Therapeutically, I used to really try to help people to develop a sense of self-compassion. And it was always striking to me, and I do it myself, I'm sure, but, the ability to have compassion for others while at the same time sometimes having the inability to share the same compassion for oneself and to be so harsh or judgmental towards oneself. I do think it's important to begin with oneself in terms of love and compassion. And from there, there's tremendous possibility.
Thank you so much, Chris, for that message. Thank you for being open to these questions, for being here today, for your presence, and for the wisdom that you share, and the work you do, of course. That's very close to my heart. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you.
If life had one purpose only, what would that be?
It's a wonderful question. I'll just come with the first thing that comes to mind. When I read something, I keep a book of just handwritten quotes of things that feel meaningful to me. And when I first started doing that a number of years back, there's a quote on one of the first pages I wrote, that says, live in such a way so that when you die, your love continues to grow. And it sort of, I think it has capacity both for the time and the space that I have on the earth to both experience love or receive as well as give love, but live in a way where that legacy then continues as well generationally and to the world around me. So I don't know. It's a big question, but I think that's an important way to think about it.
Yes, that's a big, beautiful answer. Love. Yeah, that would be my answer too. Love unconditionally. I would add that word for sure.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Chris, again. And before we say goodbye for today, where can we find more information about you, your work, services, and future projects?
Thanks for asking. Very simply, I would direct people to go to wellbridge.org. It's one word, wellbridge.org.
Yes, I'll have that link on your podcast profile. Thank you again, and we'll talk soon. Bye for now, Chris.
Thank you for listening. To learn more about Dr. Christopher and his work, please visit wellbridge.org.
To learn more about this podcast, please visit fitforjoy.org/podcast. Thank you again for listening, and bye for now.